Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Okay, welcome back here to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism, with myself, Adam Piercy, and my co-host, Mick Mulroy. So I am in Ontario, which is bracing for a winter storm that's coming through, although I should say in my history of winter storms, pretty mild. Mick, you are coming to us from the road. Tell us a little bit about where you're from today.
Yes, Washington, D.C., actually right over the river into Virginia, right next to the Pentagon. And as our podcast today is about remembrance, I'm actually within a short walk to Arlington National Cemetery. So I think I will include at least a story about Arlington in our discussions today. So a very appropriate place for this, at least in the United States. Veterans Day is on Tuesday. So very
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah, and today we were going to talk about remembrance and remembering, and how we view that as Stoics. As you already hinted at, it's Veterans Day in the United States on November 11th, which is for you and I coming up this Tuesday. And I grew up with that being Remembrance Day, or if you're in Europe, a lot of the times I call it Armistice Day on the continent, and that's what I grew up with it being. Also, there's always been a famous connection to Remembrance Day, which is that the famous poem in Flanders Fields was written actually by a Canadian Army officer from who was in Flanders at the time of the Battle of Ypres, or Wipers as they would have called it. And a funny story actually with that is that, and I don't know, we'll get onto the podcast, is I actually went to junior college in Switzerland with a young woman who was his great niece or great granddaughter or something like that. So I have an odd connection to that poem from my own life. But yeah, it's a time of reflection. It's a time of thinking a lot about some of the conflicts that have happened in the past. And I asked Mick, but I think Mick, you were wanting to do one on this topic as well, because it's a very important point. And when we think about where Stoics come from in the history of the world, they come from a time of deep conflict and constant wars and battles and things like that sort of happening all the time. So, but I mean, Mick, I'd love to prompt you a little bit to kind of walk us into this, because I think Remembrance Day and Veterans Day and Armistice Day is always tied to conflict, specifically to war. And it'd be interesting to get your first take on how you see remembrance and how you see it as a Stoic as well.
Yeah, so I mean, remembrance, of course, is beyond just remembering those that fought in conflicts. I think certainly I do. Remember ones I love that's passed. I think that's a very important part of being human, quite frankly, remembering that, especially for those that were close to you. But when it comes to a broader appreciation and remembrance, I really focus on those that have, uh, given the ultimate sacrifice for freedom, right? So not just fought in the war. There's plenty of people who fought in the war who fought on the wrong side, right? Um, so I focus on those, and not just soldiers. Veterans Day is about soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Um, but for all those that fought for freedom, whether you were a civil rights activist that was killed, or whether you were a soldier on the battlefield liberating Europe from the Nazis, for example. And by the way, I would put a serious plug in for the movie Nuremberg. Saw it on Thursday. First time I've been to a movie theater in a long time. I'm glad it was for that movie. It's extraordinary. It's very well acted. Russell Crowe and Rami Malek should both win the Academy Awards. And it is extraordinarily pressing, not to get off topic here, but it talks about the fact that it could happen again. And it wasn't anything specific or unusual necessarily for that time and place, that this barbarity could happen again. I would recommend anybody that's not just interested in history, but interested in making sure that this kind of tyranny doesn't come back in the world. Watch that movie. It's difficult to watch. I'll just give you a warning there. Um, but again, remembrance, I think, from the Stoic perspective, takes two parts. You know, I mean, we could go through a litany of quotes that talks about how you should live every day like it's your last. For Stoicism, right? Certainly not the only philosophy that thinks that, but I think the point is that you should view it that way, because not only do you have a chance to do something good and you don't put it off to tomorrow, considering it could be your last day, but also those around you, right? That
Yeah.
they should matter every day. The ones
Yeah.
you care about. Not it works both ways, right? If you view every day like it's your last day, then it's also your last day with your loved ones. So, and I think a lot of people in modern society don't think about it enough. And I remember, to attach this to the veteran state concepts, when I started, my old unit took incredible amount of casualties in World War on terror, as they call it. And I started seeing dudes spend more time with their families, for sure, when they were actually back home, and start actually saying things that weren't um, common to their friends, like
Right.
expressions of love and stuff, which just doesn't happen in, my group. I actually noticed it to a point where I'm like, I don't know if they're consciously thinking about this, but they do realize that every time they see somebody, it could be the last time, right? And you're
Right.
going to go on a mission, and it's, who knows how it's going to go, right? Um,
Yeah.
it stuck with me because it was a stark change in what, the perception of type of guys that were in my unit. And I
Yeah.
think it's important to point that out, not just to people who might be going into armed combat, of course, but everybody,
Yeah.
right? You don't know. You could get hit by a bus, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not this all these heroic, last stands on a mountaintop. Um,
Yeah.
but for remembrance, I think both are important. Remember that you could be gone tomorrow, and
Hmm.
part of you being gone tomorrow is that's it. Everybody you care about. So the last time you saw them was, you know, might not have been on the best terms. So I would
Right.
say, to start this, it's deeply ingrained in Stoicism to treat every day like it's last. And it is the best way to be remembered by those you care about, to treat
Right.
every day like it's last.
Right. And, I think that's a good thread to kind of carry into and carry as we talk about this, because um, so in Pierre Hadot's book, The Inner Citadel, which he writes about, it's basically the whole book is a commentary on Marcus Aurelius' meditations and other Stoic concepts. Um, he has a section of one of the chapters literally titled "Remembering the Dead," and he opens with saying, um, "As we have seen, the meditations are dominated from one end to the other by the thought of death. Within the work, death appears successively as an imminence which may prevent Marcus from finally raising himself up to the level of the philosophical life, or as a phenomenon of nature which is no more extraordinary than any other. And finally, as a liberation which will deliver Marcus from a world where people are ignorant of the sole value, that of virtue and the moral good." And so it was interesting to me to open with that for that section of this book, because it is very important to mention that. When Marcus Aurelius opens one of the books of meditations with thank yous to people, I think it's very poignant when you think about the fact that he is thanking people that in many cases are no longer there. He's thanking his adoptive father Antoninus Pius, whose death actually is what elevated him to being the emperor, right? And there's so many other people, and we know as well from his life that he had something like 12 children, and 7 of them didn't make it into adulthood or something like that. I can't remember exactly, and he was losing people throughout his life. And there's a choice that you make, I think, as a Stoic, to be cognizant of the fact that this is a limited time and we have to remember these things, and we have to remember to say thank you and be grateful for these moments, right? And those days of remembrance, while today are I agree with you, focused heavily on the military and conflict, I also think it's an important time to think about it from a different perspective as well, of just remembrance of those that have come before that may no longer be around, right? And I think we as Stoics generally are people who are retrospective and introspective. We look at ourselves and the past that we come from a lot. And I don't know that that's unique, but I do think that it's framed in a very positive way in Stoicism. So, but I don't know. So, so one thing I wanted to talk a little bit though about the conflict side of things, because it's interesting as a Stoic. When I was traveling, I grew up in the UK and Europe, as you know, Mick. I don't know if I've talked about that too much on the podcast. I was lucky enough to attend the Armistice Day ceremony at the Menin Gate in Belgium, which is this large arched gate with the names of, I'm not even sure what the number is. And I got to see that. And they take it very seriously that this will never happen again. Right. And, I think there's something we should talk about a little bit today, which is memorials. I get asked by questions by people where they say things like, well, would a Stoic go to a memorial service? Or they would say, for a military thing. Because I think some people think it glorifies war or something like that. And the way I see it is the opposite. I think it's specifically trying to not glorify war. It's trying to say that they didn't die for nothing. And I agree with that. But I think they're also trying to say, like, we have to try not this at some point, we have to fight the last one. We have to get away from war. But I'm curious what your take on that is.
So, of course, it's important to point out that the Stoa Poke itself, the painting part of it, right? So, was depictions of past wars that they were
Mm-hmm.
victorious. Of course, people generally don't write about the ones that they lost. Um,
Right.
but for me, there's nothing glorified in war. Very little. People do heroic things for sure, and
Mm-hmm.
some wars are fought for heroic reasons, right? I already mentioned one, right? So the uh, defeat of Nazism in Europe,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
defeat of imperial Japanese conquest in Asia, something that's not talked about here
Yeah.
as much,
Yeah.
unless you go to Asia. The atrocities that were done there. That's I think honorable, absolutely honorable. But war itself is not. War itself should be avoided at all costs. It's and generally speaking, you can look at the casualties of the soldiers that fight it and quadruple it for the civilians that paid the ultimate price uh, in the process. So
Yeah.
it's absolutely horrible. And I talked a bit about it as a group I'm in. We do humanitarian stuff around the world. Uh, it's almost all in conflict areas, and it's almost all because of that man-made, right? So starving kids because of conflicts that adults started and can't seem to figure out a way to end. So I don't think we should ever glorify the war itself. Only those, I think, who fought for right and gave the ultimate sacrifice. So again, I'm here next to Arlington. One thing my unit does every year, I think a lot of units do, but we have a lot of people buried in Arlington, which is saying something considering the size of the unit and the fact that my unit wasn't even, I mean, most of everybody was in the military, but was in the agency. And
Mm-hmm.
every year we go, starting with the first one, right after World War II, which is when the unit started, came from the OSS. And we go to every tomb, grave, right? And we talk about the person and how he lived, and of course how he died. And it gets worse as you go because then you start knowing people, and it does become a bit of a pity party, I have to say, for the right reasons, missing people.
Sure.
And if we have a drink every one, and you have to pace yourself because there's like 35 people in there. We do the pour out. If you're familiar with that tradition, we pour it out
Yeah.
for our awesome. But I did start notice because doing it every year on Veterans Day, so it'll happen this week. Um, People started talking about the happy stuff, the funny stuff. That's and it needed to happen because it's you can focus on the manner of death and the sadness that comes to somebody who died too soon, but is that what they really want, or do they
Right.
want you to remember the good times? And so again, it was almost like a shift that wasn't talked about but happened. And when I was looking up quotes for the way Stoics view this, there's two that really hit this topic. One is from Seneca, the gratitude over grief. He who has lost a friend has had him. Honor him with thanks, not sorrow. And then one by Epictetus, return, not loss. Never say I have lost it, but I have returned it. What nature gives, nature reclaims. So both coming at it from a different angle, but both, I think, illustrating
Yeah.
this idea that to really honor one's life is not to be totally consumed with the sorrow of their death. I
Right.
understand it. I certainly have been there. It's very natural to be that way. But I think ultimately, and I think most people will tell you this if they lost somebody that really matters to them, putting things in perspective helps them over time to deal with their grief, to start thinking
Right.
about, not the fact that they died in a car accident or uh, some kind of illness, but how they lived and why they meant so much to you in the first place. Because it wasn't because they got in a car accident that they meant something to you, right?
Right.
So I think that's another way. And I could go, there's a lot of Stoic quotes like that that really talk about, and, obviously, my ethnic group, but the wake concept, especially the Irish one, is about that. It's about
Yeah.
turning somebody's life into a celebration. And now it's very common, right? It's not a wake, it's a celebration of life or whatever the term is now. But I think the
Yeah.
right, whatever the term is, it's the right concept. It really is to really, I think, honor by fond memories of the person of which you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And I think, when we look back at these types of ceremonies that happen on Veterans Day or Armistice Day or any, I think there's another. The one in May is Memorial Day. I think for the Americans, is that right? So, at that
The
point,
one in May
you have
is what?
the one in
Say
May
that
is
again.
Memorial. Is that Memorial Day?
Oh yeah, we have Memorial Day. That's more for everybody to remember their people. Veterans
Right.
Day is specific
Specifically to
for veterans,
yeah.
obviously. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, it's very common. I think one thing that I think is very important to talk about is how when you get to this point of remembering, right? A lot of the time you're in a circumstance where um, it seems like you're trying to glorify the war, right, and things like that again. But instead, I don't think those people would want that. I think they would want to be remembered for what they did, why they were doing it, right? There are of course these amazing moments in history from the theater or from film or whatever where it's this big glorious conflict, right, and you're doing it for something bigger than yourself, and that is a good thing, I think. But at the same time, what I choose to do on Remembrance Day is remember that these were people. They had lives, they had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and wives and girlfriends and children and grandchildren, and I mean, it's a very poignant thing to point out when it comes to the In Flanders Fields poem that John McCrae himself was killed in the war, right? And so, even this person writing this poem and trying to capture this feeling of being in Flanders at the time himself was also, you know, lost his own life in that moment. Um, and there's a point in the poem where he says, "We are the dead, not days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow." Right. So he's trying to remind everybody, like, we were just like you. We had these things before, and now we're gone. And that's something that I try to take into account as we go through this. And yes, we're tying it strictly to military stuff when we talk about that. But I think you're right. Remembrance is something that I think is a very key Stoic concept. Memento mori, being remember death. Remember
Mhm.
that this will end, but also
Mhm.
carpe diem, which is, it's attributed to Stoicism as well as other things, but ultimately, seizing the day because the day may never come again is certainly a recurring concept that you will find within our writings and practices, and I think that's very important. But I don't know, it's an interesting point. You were talking about wakes. Funny enough, with the timing, it was my grandfather's interment yesterday, and he's been gone for almost 2 years. And I chose at the ceremony to not really tell stories, but to focus on a key thing for him, which was that he always wanted his family was paramount to him, and he always wanted us to be together. And that's what I told everybody. I was like, do not. He does not want you to be sad for him. He wants you to remember that he loved being in the family and he loved fighting for us as a family. So that's what you should focus on, and you should, push to be with each other. And that I think resonates with what you were saying, right? Because we're celebrating
Yep.
what he wanted and how he lived, not the fact that they're gone. There is an absence, and it's someone like
Yes.
my grandfather. That's a big absence sometimes, but
Sure.
at the same time, we can make a choice whether to remember something as negative or positive or neutral. And in this circumstance yesterday, for example, I was choosing to make the memories be positive in their
Absolutely.
direction.
That's exactly in line with Epictetus and Seneca's statement, I think.
Yeah, comes down to that personal choice.
It
So
is a
I'm
personal
curious.
choice.
Yeah, it is a personal choice, but so I'm curious about your take on something because you were talking a little bit about when like a lot of these monuments are remembrance monuments, but some of them are also to celebrate things like victories and whatnot. Now, what I think is very interesting in history, especially modern history, is that the tone of a lot of these types of ceremonies and monuments has switched a little bit in my mind towards ones that are less about victorious, glorious battle. I don't see as much of that. I see more about remembering the people. Are you getting the same? Do you ever get the same feeling with the more recent memorials? I'm thinking like the Vietnam Memorial and whatnot, which
Yes.
is
Very good
it's
point.
very
Good
yeah. So
point.
what's your take on that? Because you're
I
actually
think,
in DC, and the Vietnam Memorial is probably not far from you.
all right. No, that's just over the river. And that's a very good point. Don't even know that I've actually thought about it before now, but I think you are spot on, right? If you look at Protect the Vietnam, so it's just names. It's just all the names who laid down their life in that conflict,
Yeah.
right? And at first, I think people are like, you should have some big, kind of traditional, old school arch to triumph or what have you. But I think the war memorials now are switching more toward we should never do this again,
Right.
right? And one of the reasons why, if not the reason why, is all these names that were, you know, fell way before their time.
Yeah.
And in the case of Vietnam, many of them are drafted, right? Um, so I do think you're seeing that. I, I think they're in the process of building the global war on terror, which is Iraq, Afghanistan.
Hmm.
I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do think
Right.
memorials should be more about that. Like, I mean, if it was something as obvious as defeating Nazism, then there should be, in my humble opinion, a bit of acknowledgement of the victory side,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, every war memorial should be about never having to build another war memorial
Hmm.
ever. And if that can come across, I hope in many ways that's every war memorial from now on is like that. And it's really worth, if you are in Washington, D.C., going to all of them. And the Korean
Yeah.
War Memorial is close to the Vietnam Memorial. It's just basically a platoon on a patrol. So you're walking through life-size statues of soldiers, right? To
Hmm.
kind of give you that feel of what it'd been like to been chosen reservoir, for example.
Yeah.
But I hope that every war memorial from now on, it does seem to be a horrible human condition that history is essentially just, a series of wars going back to antiquity. Will it change? You would hope so. Um,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one because when you look at the concept of war, right, and you look at it in relation to history, there is a famous quote saying something like, to study the history of civilization is to study the history of war. And that makes me feel not great, actually. I don't like
Yeah.
that concept around it, but it's not I'm going to be honest and face the truth that it's not an untrue statement, right?
No, it's not.
But I
And a lot
was,
of our innovations come directly out of our desire to figure out a better way to kill somebody else. It's
oh, I
sad,
mean, look,
but it's true.
yeah, I mean, you yourself work in a field that is trying to alleviate the harm to people that comes from war and conflict, right? I work in a field that came out of conflict, right? The
Yep,
space race, which created the space programs of today, came out of the
absolutely.
Cold War, and I do not forget that fact. In fact, when I laughed when I was sorry, laughing is the wrong term. I laughed in the sense of it was so odd when I was thinking about today's episode, in the sense that most of the people that I have books on from the early days of the space race, who I take deep lessons from, I'll use names like Gene Kranz or George Low or um, uh, most of the actually all the astronauts who landed on the moon, they had served in the military at some time,
Sure.
right? Except for
Yep.
I think one, which was Jack Schmidt, who was a scientist, but he may have been in the military. I just don't know. But like they were all military guys, right? I mean, you look at Werner von Braun and his history, which he built the
hmm
Saturn V, right? Like, but he invented the V2 and the V. He
hmm
worked on all of those programs, and it's an interesting thing. So I like to think it's a positive human trait that we can turn something so destructive into something so innovative for the future. I'd like
Sure.
to think that way, but I feel like sometimes I'm thinking about it from rose through with I'm looking at it through rose-colored glasses, right? Where I'm thinking that, but at the same time, we have to make a choice, right? We have to make a choice what to do. I don't think the people who fight, who the people who were killed in these conflicts would want us to sit there and wallow. I do think they're hoping that everything becomes better because of that.
Yeah.
But being in the space race, we talk about that. Like when you look at it, every rocket that launched an astronaut up until in the United States, and I'll only quote on that one because that's I work a lot with NASA, but I'm in Canada. But every rocket that launched an American astronaut was a missile, except until it came to the Saturn V, right? Like the Gemini was launched on a Titan II, the Mercuries were on Atlases and Redstones, and so I do look at that as a positive, but at the same time, like, is that what we have to do to get things better? I don't know. I don't think that that's the right way to look at it. And I want to tie this back to Stoicism in the way of when we think, and we've talked about this a little bit before, when we talk about Marcus Aurelius, you know, he actually, as much as he led troops into battle, as much as he was considered, commander in chief in general, he actually spent most of his time on the northern frontier trying not to have battles, trying not to have wars. He
hmm
was signing peace treaties. He was paying people like the Marcomanni not to fight them, just like
hmm
stay on your side of the river. We'll stay on
hmm
ours. Let's be nice, right? And it's not that he was naive. It's just I don't think he was personally someone who thought that war was the greatest thing ever. People think of Marcus Aurelius in the way of Gladiator, where the movie opens
hmm
with that big battle against the Germanic tribes from the north, but in
Yep.
reality, Marcus signed so many treaties, and he, there's all these circumstances where he could have just flattened somebody, and he decided not to, and that's the thing I think that's we need to try and remember, because he does remember. He spends a lot of time remembering in his meditations about the people from the past. And I think
Yeah.
that's what I as a Stoic would want to take going forward, is this idea of like, yes, it's bad. I'm not saying we can't. You can't. You and I have talked about this before. We can't expect to not have conflicts, but we really need to get to the point where we can talk about this being. We have to have the last war. Like that has to happen at some point. Is it going to happen in my lifetime? I don't know. I can't guarantee that, but I don't believe that armed conflict is the right way. But I mean, I don't think anybody does really. It's just, humans,
I
unfortunately.
hope nobody does, but some people in some countries do. I
Yeah,
think there's several points there. So the quickest way to war is weakness, right? So
right.
what happens when countries believe that they can actually take what they can't get themselves?
Mm,
Your weakness actually creates the scenario for war, right?
Yeah.
So I am no way a dove. You might have guessed that. I am all
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
being the strongest and most capable military in the world. In my case, for the United States, like
Right.
that shouldn't be an option. But I think that would make war less likely because I think
Yeah.
anybody who's actually been in a war, certainly up close and personal, um, doesn't want to be in another one, and certainly doesn't want his kids to be in another. But I think strength actually makes it less likely that your country will be in a war. If that,
Right.
if you follow my logic there,
Hmm.
I also, and it's very precedent or relevant what you bring up because I've talked several times in the last 2 weeks as an analyst about the fact that several treaties are going to expire and nobody's talking about extending. So the New START Treaty, just for example, that is the agreement between the United States and Russia and other nuclear countries about the numbers of nuclear weapons, right? And it's just going to expire in February, right? So this idea that you talk about with treaties to prevent wars and stuff,
Mm.
you seem to be going away from that and going away from the concepts inside the UN that were created after World War II, whether it's the Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, all these things try to mitigate the consequences of war and potentially prevent a war
Yeah.
are just not seeming. People just don't seem to, by people, I mean politically, just don't seem to be wanting to continue them or make more strict ones or new ones, just new ones, right? And there's also
Right.
like the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. I don't know if I remember the correct
Yeah.
name. Well, I mean, now we're talking about testing nuclear weapons. I know we're getting a little. It's still really relevant to what we're talking about. Like, so
Yeah.
if
And I think
one
it is.
country starts testing nuclear weapons, the next one country's going to start. Then other countries going to say, "Well, hell, I got to get in this gang," right?
Right.
And then if alliances start not trusting in alliances, right, challenging NATO inside NATO, all the countries in NATO said, "Well, I can't really trust these guys to come to my defense, so I want a nuclear weapon," right? So that this, with not having these solid alliances, showing
Yeah.
strength together, and respecting the treaties that many, if not most, countries signed on to, that's going to lead us more toward war, which lead us more toward having to remember people who should never had to have gone to war to be remembered for dying in conflict in the first place.
Yeah. And something that, as a civilian, I understand that there's things I will never know unless something horrible happens in the world, right? I will never know some of how these things go. But as a civilian, when I look at these things and the people who are in charge of these things, I am consistently shocked right now. I am consistently shocked right now because it just feels like we're getting back into this tribal us versus them situation. And I just can't believe that. Growing up in Europe, when I went to Commonwealth war graves in Western Europe, for example, there were war graves for the Allied forces and the Western forces, but there were also war graves for the I would say the enemy combatants of that. Either it's in the First World War would be the Germans, and in the Second World War it would have been the third. I'll call it the Third Reich because it was a couple of countries was the Axis powers, right? And the thing is I do not wish to glorify enemy combatants. That's not what I am suggesting, but they at least understood that we had to have the dignity to understand that there were two sides of the conflict and that people were fighting, and that these were human beings at least, right?
Of
And I feel
course, and a
right
lot of them
now
had no
like
choice to fight,
I
right?
know, I know exactly, right?
Right?
And that's the thing is I sit there going, I am lucky enough to have seen these, and I urge anyone listening to this podcast, like on Remembrance Day, go to these services, go to these memorials. They're not about glorifying war. They're about talking about what happened and remembering that a lot of people lost their lives to give us what we have today, right? The peace that we have today. But I think it's very poignant in this circumstance to talk about the fact that, like, just because somebody's on the enemy side, they might not be horrible people. They're just trying to do what they think is right as well, right? I don't
Oh,
agree
yes.
with enemy combatants' opinions, but I do believe in the greater humanity of all of us together. And so when I hear about things like this is there's the conflict is upping. I mean, the I can't remember who it is, but the group that has the clock that's like minutes to midnight or whatever for the where we stand
Yes.
on,
Yes. Yep.
the doomsday clock, right? It's not getting any farther away from midnight, right? And that to me is extremely disappointing. It's not so much fear for my own life. I mean, like there's many things I can't control, right? But it is fear for where we go as a population. We are a civilization trying to build itself and exist in a world where we could obliterate ourselves 100 times over. Like that just doesn't make it. Just doesn't work, right? The math doesn't math, as I sometimes say jokingly to my friends when I talk
Mhm.
about other things. And that's where I stand right now. So, I think a key point to bring up for everybody in this, in history, for example, George Marshall, who was, I don't know that he was a
Yeah.
Stoic, but I know that he was sort of exposed to it. And I read his biography recently. At the end of the Second World War, George had a decision that he could make. Right, he could say we
Mhm.
could take over Europe and then start pushing
Mhm.
against the Soviet Union and all of that stuff. But instead, he decided to rebuild it. To rebuild it because these people needed help, right? And when
Mhm.
he did that, right, he created this world that we live in now, where Europe is a very stable place and it does well and
Yeah.
it's free from a lot of conflict. And like that doesn't happen by accident. That happens because a human being makes a decision to stop the violence and move towards a rebuilding program. And the Marshall Plan is known as that, which comes out of the Monroe Doctrine, I think. The Marshall Plan is always known for that. And I was raised, the Berlin airlifts and all of those things. Those are humanitarian things. That's way more in the line of work that you do with the Lobo Institute. And sorry, I'm probably ranting and get a little bit angry here, but it's a struggle for me as a person who's had to see these battlefields. I've had to hear these stories, and had to is the wrong word, wrong verb, but like I've listened to these stories, and you just say, like, does it feel like we're getting farther from that or closer again? And I'm not sure which one it is right now. And that bothers me because when I grew up, it was always that we were trying to not have those anymore. No more wars,
Yep.
no more conflicts, and I don't think that's happening. And you know, my message to anyone thinking about this is like, just think about what's on the other side. It's not us versus them. We're all human beings. We're all human beings. We all have fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and wives and girlfriends and boyfriends and whatever. So remember that those are people too. They might have conflicting views from you. They might have different learned, educational structures or whatever that change the way they see the world, but they are at the very base level human beings. And I just don't think we improve ourselves by killing each other.
Right.
Rant over. Sorry,
And
rant
good.
over.
Well said. I think. I mean, George Marshall for me is, when it comes to leadership, my favorite in World War II. Right. He not only
Yeah.
was an extraordinary general, but he was an extraordinary humanitarian, which is why they gave him the Nobel Prize. And he was very humble about the whole thing.
Yeah.
He lived modestly, and if you're ever in a town called Leesburg, Virginia, that's where he retired to, and his house is there, and it's now, I think, a federal mark, historic site. And you can go
Historic site.
there,
Yeah.
and they have like movies out on his lawn, for everybody and stuff like that. It's got a name. I can't remember the name right now, but if you ever buy Leesburg, it's worth showing gratitude at least to a guy who, like you said, um, could have been very vindictive, but instead um, thought much more broadly and much more humanely uh, in his attitude toward those that the United States and our allied partners defeat, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So and I think it's interesting to think about it that he's the chief of staff for Franklin Roosevelt's army, right? And so everybody
Mhm.
reports to him, including
Yeah.
Eisenhower.
Yep.
So he's essentially the second, like he's the.
He's
I
the
mean,
most
now I
senior
may be mixing
military
these things.
member. Yeah,
Right,
he
he's the most
is.
senior military
Yeah.
member under the president, right? And
Yep.
he has that decision to make. And I've consistently gone back on this because he did it twice actually in his life. When he put his foot down about in the area that we now know of as like Israel and Palestine. He had a hand in
Hmm.
trying to create what that was going to look like after
Hmm.
the war, for example. And in both circumstances, it's always seemed like he was doing the humanitarian thing. He could
Yeah.
have come in with a fist and just swiped everything off the table. And that's where I find myself I don't know, going back to all the time. And yes, and I should say something that will sound odd, but like in my day-to-day life, I do try to take this into account. We have conflicts all the time, right? Everybody does. You get a bad email from somebody, you get whichever. Just remember that they're all human beings, and things seem to go a lot better. But yeah, it's an interesting time. This is always a very interesting time for me as well, because this is this is something that I know my partner and I have talked about. I don't allow any Christmas decorations to go up between October 31st and November 12th. And that sounds like a weird thing to say, but I actually, and Mick, you know this because I put this out on my social media all the time. These 11 days are days of remembrance. They're all days of remembrance. And you wear the poppy in Canada, in the Commonwealth nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you wear the poppy. And in Europe, they wear the poppy. And I am always of the mind of just hold off on Thanksgiving and Christmas. We owe them those 11 days, you know? And I think that's a really important thing to me. It says a lot about a people if they have a day of remembrance like November 11th. I think that's very important. But it says even more if they can withhold their excitement for fun things to make sure that they remember the tough things, right?
Yeah. And I have I don't know if you can call it a quote. It's from a fictional movie that was based on at least the true story of the Nealon brothers. But I think it serves two purposes. One, it shows why we remember those who gave the ultimate sacrifice. And two, why this seize the day, treat every day as its last, is so important. But it's in the fictional movie, again, based on true other story, called Saving Private Ryan. I probably don't need to tell anybody what movie that is.
Yeah.
But it's at the end, right? When Ryan goes out to the grave of the person that was sent to save him, right? And so he said, every day I think about what you said to me that day on the bridge. I tried to live my life the best I could. I hope that was enough. I hope at least in your eyes, I've earned what all you have done for me. I think that says it all.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good point for us to wrap up. Somber note, but definitely one that I think is important. I would ask that everybody who listens today to join me in doing something I do every time this time of year, which is for those in my life who have served. I have not, but for those in my life who have served. So Dana, my friend Dana from the office, my friend Mick, obviously who I'm podcasting with now, and others. Thank you for your service. It's definitely not forgotten in my eyes, at least. So thank you for everything. But I hope that if you do have the opportunity to go to a service on November 11th, you do. If you're in Europe listening to this, I know it's Armistice Day, and that's a very important day for you. So I hope that day goes well and you get the chance to go to a service. But no matter what, on November 11th, I hope that you do take a chance to remember what has happened and what we hope not to happen again in the future. So this will probably be Mick and I signing off. Mick.
Yep. I'll be walking through Arlington yet again.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for this episode. We'll catch you on the next one. Cheers, Mick.
Cheers, brother.
Thank you for listening to the Pup and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pupandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pupandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pup and Porch out.